Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Roel and Francois.
Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. I am joined here with our co-host Francois and a special guest, Dave Benham. How are you doing, Francois?
Hey, I'm very good. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a good morning. It's not as cold, and so that I'm happy about that. I know it's snowing where you are.
Yeah, we got plenty of snow over the weekend. Maybe Dave got some snow as well where he is.
Dave, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I don't know if it's snowing where you are. I know Francois showed me a photo of something, and then I saw his window, and I said, "Oh my gosh, that's a ton of snow."
Yeah, it snowed over the last week. We've gotten probably 8 inches or so. It's really cold this morning. I think it's 7 Fahrenheit this morning. So.
I see. Nice. I guess that's a benefit for me and living in California is I barely see any snow. If I do, it's usually on the mountaintops and it's nowhere near me.
Yeah, see it from afar and enjoy the beauty where it's warm.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Dave, I think we've actually talked about you on the show. I remember a long time ago at Cisco Live, I think it was the Vegas one or Florida or Orlando, where we actually did a quick interview of you and then we played that on the show. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah. It was like 6 quick questions or something like that.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. That was like some little segment we were trying to do on our show to introduce other people in the Wi-Fi industry, and then we actually just saw you out on the show floor and asked if you could join us.
Yeah,
I'll try to find the episode and put the.
You're trying to find it, yeah. We'll add a link to that in the show notes. But for those people who can't find it or won't listen to it, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone here on the show?
Well, my name is Dave Benham. I manage mobility practice for the Midwest for a large VAR, and I'm a technical escalation point as well as handling the training and pre-sales and post-sales support for our customers. I've been doing Wi-Fi for about 20 years, I'd say, give or take, and I sort of built our practice at this company back in like 2003 is when we really started to take Wi-Fi seriously. So yeah, I really enjoy it. It's a passion of mine. I've been doing RF related things since I was a kid. I've been a ham radio operator since I was 8. So
oh wow,
it's just sort of in my blood.
Very nice. That's impressive. I like that. I myself haven't gotten into ham radio yet. I think I've downloaded some study guides for the exam. And so what I've typically done is just use an iPhone app to listen to the radio to different frequencies, but I haven't actually picked up a ham radio, which I should. I should make some time for that.
I mean, it's a fun hobby. I think it's becoming more dated now. I mean, as the internet came around, it took away some of the magic of being able to talk to someone on the other side of the world for free. But it's still a great hobby. It's fun. And I learned a lot about RF fundamentals and antenna principles and things like that through my studies to get that license.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we have you here on this show because we're actually going to talk about some tips on migrating to the Cisco Catalyst 9800. And this is the new wireless controller from Cisco. It's actually vastly different from what we're used to using on Cisco's controllers, which are AirOS based. This is a controller that's iOS based. And so we know you've done a couple of these deployments, which means now you've got all these ideas in your head and some mobility practices on migrating. And we think it's good to have you on the show to talk about some of these challenges that you've ran into and maybe make a migration a little bit smoother for others who are planning on doing the same thing.
All right.
Yeah. So Why don't we give an introduction to the Catalyst 9800 for those who are not familiar with it? Dave, would you be able to do that since you're you're more tuned to it than we are? I'm still on the AeroOS controller.
Sure. Yeah. So the 9800 is Cisco's next generation of wireless controller, and it is based on iOS XE, like you mentioned. It's no longer an AeroOS platform, so they didn't just evolve the existing platform. They started from the ground up, and it's not related to the 5760 platform that they tried to release a few years back. This was a fresh start, which is a good thing because that controller was not so good.
Yeah.
So it's all iOS, so the config looks a lot like a switch when you see it, which is very welcome in my opinion. Gone are the days of having your WLAN config spread between the top, the middle, and the bottom of your configuration file in different sections. Everything is indented and containerized like normal iOS and iOS XE stuff. But other than that, a lot of the principles are the same. They might be called different things, but the concepts that you've been familiar with over the years with Cisco controllers still exist.
Okay. The big thing is it's iOS XE, but the concepts are just, they may have been moved around in the GUI, but if you've been using iOS XE, you have that familiarity. And I know when you're dealing with a Cisco iOS or AeroOS, like the commands they're not the same. So if you're not as familiar with AeroOS command line, then you tend to struggle a little and try to figure out what the commands are. But with iOS XE, like you said, it is like a switch. And Francois and I have been playing with the virtual version. Would you be able to briefly say if there's anything different between the virtual 9800 versus a physical appliance?
So the virtual one has the same feature set, which is great. In the AeroOS days, there was a lot of caveats to the virtual version. The only real caveat to the virtual version in the 9800 is that the throughput is limited. So if you're going to centralize the client traffic, which you can do, you're limited to, I think officially it's 1.5 gigs of aggregate throughput, regardless of how robust your VM environment is. You're limited to that. But otherwise, all of the features and functionality exists in the virtual.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's a lot of flexibility here in this deployment because you can start out very small and then grow into a more larger scale installation, right?
Yep. And the nice thing about it too is the virtual version, so when you deploy it in VMware, and I have most of the experience in the VMware version, there's also an AWS and a Google Cloud and I think a KVM version as well. But the VMware version, the resources are more realistic than a lot of other Cisco products like Prime and things that just take basically your entire virtual host. This is something like 4 cores and 8 gig of RAM for 1,000 APs. That's pretty reasonable. So
it's not bad.
Likely that you could spin this up at your house in your home lab and have some fun with it and learn.
Yeah, definitely.
I was going to say, if you think about it, a wireless controller is just software, right? So I was going to say it's about time that they came up with a solution where we can have flexibility and, putting that software wherever we want, right? Whether it's on a small VM at home or in the cloud, or, give the customer the flexibility to put the controller wherever we see fit in our organization.
Yeah, that flexibility is pretty key for a lot of deployments now because of the nature of the business. And I think a lot of people will start comparing these controllers to the cloud managed. How do you deal with those types of questions, Dave, when someone goes, why should I go with the Catalyst 9800? Why don't I just go with, say, a Meraki and handle this all in the cloud?
Usually for me, it boils down to tweakability. A lot of my customers need more tuning capabilities and just the nerd knobs that you get with a controller-based environment. Some of my customers need to be able to centralize that traffic as well, either for their own security policies because they need to funnel it through a web filter or something, or for some other reason, the way that their campus is designed, that's a big reason for it. But personally, I like it because I get a lot more tweakability to tune RF and to tune the settings just the way it needs to be to make that environment perform as well as it can perform. A lot of the cloud-based solutions are very limited. They're a nice, pretty dashboard, and you're limited in what you can tune.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's my biggest push is if you need to tune it to a certain degree, then you're going to need something a little bit more flexible, where if you need something more towards simplicity and maybe you're not going to touch the knobs as much and there's very limited knobs, then you can go with a cloud-based management system. So I think that's all pretty good. And I like that. It boils down to tweakability.
Yeah, that's a nice term. Just circling back on the the new OS, I think it's important to mention that they re-architecture the software differently, so it's more flexible for us as engineers if we want to update something, if we want to patch something. With AirOS, you kind of have to reboot everything once you need to do an upgrade or an update. Here with the iOS XE platform, we'll have a little bit more flexibility. We could patch some features without having to reboot everything. We could do a localized upgrade. They even have a feature where you can, upgrade. If you have two controllers, you can upgrade APs group per AP group in order to keep your Wi-Fi service alive while you upgrade. So I think that's important to mention too for the new Catalyst 9800 is that the software is a little bit more the architecture of the software is more flexible as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's going to be a lot of things that people will want to test out since Cisco is doing this new, and I know some of their competitors have already added this for quite some time, but I think looking forward, it can only get better from here on out, especially with the software updates. Why don't we go into? Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was just going to say it's definitely the ability for upgrading without taking down clients, things like that, is definitely improving as time goes on. And the virtual version allows you to set up SSO and HA, which you couldn't do with AirOS. So you can test all of this in a lab without actually buying any hardware. If you want to see how well SSO works on a 9800, you could spin up 2 VMs and establish SSO and test it, which is great.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's an easy way to test it without spending large amounts of money on a physical appliance just to, without even knowing if it does work. But yeah, that's a good point. And being able to spin something up in a lab. And me and Francois have done that, is just download the virtual version and spin it up. You get a little trial. I forget how many days, but once you add an AP, it's on a trial license. And 90 days, yeah, which is enough to even just get started on taking a look at the features and understanding the configuration model, which I guess is a good segue into some of the tips on migrating. So this is the core piece of our conversation here, because not many people are going to go from just a fresh install of a controller and then go straight up 9800 and I got new APs. There's going to be a lot of people migrating from their current infrastructure, which is going to be AirOS based, and that could be any version of those controllers. And so your first tip, Dave, was understanding the configuration model. I think that's a great place to start. Can you dive into that a little?
Yeah, so this is something that I struggled with for a long time when I was first introduced to the 9800s, and it's one of those things where it's just the more you work with it, the more it will make sense, and one day it will click. So there are some substantial changes in the way that the configuration model is set up versus AirOS. There aren't AP groups anymore. Some of the stuff that you've known and loved for the last decade or more in AirOS is the concepts are there, but the way that you implement it is very different. So you'll want to spend some time familiarizing yourself with the new configuration model. And Cisco's got some good documentation with diagrams trying to help you understand where the configuration exists now. And like I said, one day it'll just click. And it's hard to explain other than that. But the more you play with it, the easier it'll get. A lot of the stuff that you're used to seeing in the advanced tab of the WLAN configuration, for instance, is no longer in the WLAN. And it's not in the WLAN config because it's not WLAN related stuff. It's more site related stuff. So it's been moved to site profiles and things like that. And it'll all make sense at some point. It scales a lot better. And I think you'll really appreciate it once it clicks. But that's
and
by
they're
far
using profiles. Yeah, I was going to say they use profiles tags, so you can tag all your different profiles together, and at the end of the day, it kind of makes sense, like you said. It's more flexible too.
Yep.
I was going to say, it sounds like that's why you should do the trial at first, 90 days to get familiar with the new configuration model, the new terms, the terminology, and how exactly these profiles and tags work, because that's the new model is now dealing with profiles, tags. What else is there? I know those were the two big ones, and understanding how to apply those tags.
There's 3 different tags that every access point has. It's got a policy tag, a site tag, and an RF tag, and that binds the configuration to that access point. And you can have those tags assigned automatically based on the AP name, which is outstanding. So you can automatically have an access point inherit all this configuration just based on its name. It can actually switch it to Flex Connect. It can switch it to Mesh just based on the AP name. So there's a lot of really cool features like that once you start to digest config model looks like.
And one of the bigger things with the 9800 as well when it comes to the configuration model is its programmability, because AirOS wasn't very flexible at all when it came. We usually just had to deal with SNMP, but with the 9800, I don't know if you have dealt with this before, which we'll link out in the show notes. You have a blog post where you start grabbing some telemetry from the 9800. So that's one thing. One other thing to know with this new configuration model is being able to get more information out of this using like Python or using netconf and all these other things. Have you been playing a lot with that, Dave?
I have. Yeah, it's both ways. It's much easier to push configuration to it, and it's much easier to get information out of it. So it's all around better with third-party integration. One of my blog articles is on pulling statistics and telemetry out of it and visualizing it in Grafana, and that's kind of the easy thing. Just kind of make your own dashboard to see what statistics exist in the controller. But as you start to deploy more and more of these, you'll probably want to look at the opposite end of that, which is pushing configuration out to your controllers with netconf. And it's the same model. It's just different sequences and different commands. It works remarkably well.
It sounds like the possibilities here are pretty big, especially this first iteration of the code. I mean, they're not that far into versions with the 9800. I think it's only been about 2 or 3 versions with updates. And mostly those updates are also including the newer APs. But when it comes to pushing configuration, does that mean we could create a dashboard, a more simple dashboard for maybe some junior guys to just push a simple config to a WLAN?
Yes, yeah. And you could be able to view clients on a dashboard and maybe have a button to kick a client off the network or do some troubleshooting, interact with the client. You can do just about anything that you can do in the GUI, you can push from netconf as well.
Wow. So that means a lot of people probably start asking, do I need Prime anymore? And
you can create your own dashboard meeting your specific needs.
Yeah, you don't need Prime if you can program all this together.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, Prime is nice, but sometimes, like, the way I feel, when I use Prime is I feel like depending on what I'm doing, I'm struggling to find, the proper graph. I'm struggling to find the exact information that I'm looking for. So I think, in the future, it will be just easier to just create your own dashboard for your needs. And then at least you will be visualizing exactly what you need. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And you're not using SNMP.
Yeah, and you're not using SNMP.
It's all streamed toward the dashboard versus having to be pulled on a 5-minute basis or whatever. So the updates are almost instantaneous.
Yeah, that's a question I had for you, Dave, is how often do you get an update? Like, can you configure it or can you get it every second?
You can configure it. So what I outlined in my blog article is just a 1 second update. So every second it sends it. You can change it to anything you want. Another option is also on change. So when that statistic changes, it will send an update, and only when it changes. And I haven't
like
done
an
a lot
AP
of
going
testing.
up and down.
Right. That's a lot more efficient way of doing it. But the way that my graphs work, it was easier for me just to have it update every second, and I wasn't that worried about the amount of data that it was going to store in a database. So I just have an update every second. But it is configurable for each subscription. So you could have some stuff update every second, some stuff 5 seconds, some on change, some 30 seconds. It's totally scalable.
Nice. Yeah, and I encourage everyone to look at Dave's blog on setting up that telemetry. The links will be in the show notes, but it's really neat because you can now take a controller and just graph just about anything that's available to use via the API, and using open source tools while you're at it. So it's a good way to start building your own dashboards and start looking at things that only matter to your environment. You don't have to track everything. You can just get the information that you care about. And it is a new way of dealing with the controllers. And yeah, maybe you don't need Prime, but you do need to understand how to put this all together, right? So it's going to require some skills that you may not have, or maybe you can utilize somebody else in your team that has the skills to put this together. But Dave kind of gives you that outline of what's involved, right? What does it look like? It doesn't look as hard, excuse me, if you're just trying to graph some things like the AP counts and maybe the number of clients. You can start there, and then as you get more familiar with it, start building out something a little bit more complicated.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because those two statistics are probably the ones that I struggled with the most. The number of agents that are currently connected and the number of clients that are currently connected. Those you would think would be the easiest low-hanging fruit you can get. And for whatever reason, the way that is laid out in the Yang model makes it more difficult. You've got to be smarter with your queries than I am to get that to work.
Yeah, that's where we'll have to build our skills on, right? Is it's not just Wi-Fi anymore. It's a lot more to it, where people want certain dashboards, they want data, they want to know what they can do with that data. But yeah, I mean, that's a different discussion. I mean, I just wanted to add the programmability to this configuration model, because that's something you may need to do in your configuration, is build a dashboard, for example. And basically, the only thing on the controller side, though, is you're just enabling netconf, right?
You're enabling netconf, and then you set up subscriptions to each of the types of data that you want to be sent to your dashboard. So it's a little bit more complicated than just enabling netconf. You have to look at the Yang model and figure out where the statistics are to know what to enable, because you don't want to enable everything. It'll be an overwhelming amount of data.
Yeah, and then that's just a resource hog, isn't it? If you're just querying something that you don't need.
Yeah, it's storing a lot more data on the data. All of this stuff gets streamed into a database, and then the dashboard looks into the database to get the data. So it is going to take up a lot of space in a database and subscribe to everything. So I was trying to narrow it down to the stuff I was interested in. It does make it more difficult, but it's more efficient too.
Exactly. All right, why don't we get into your next tip on migrating to the Catalyst 9800?
Okay, so the next one is just basically, this is a great time to start fresh with your config, kind of rebuild your network from scratch, because you probably have a lot of wreckage in your config from the past 10 or 15 years that you've had your AirOS controllers. I don't know anyone who doesn't have something in there that they forgot about, or that they
completely messed up.
Yeah, you're not using it anymore. You've got old WLANs that are disabled. All that stuff, if you use the migration tool, which we'll talk about in a second, that all gets migrated over. And it's not that hard to start fresh in most cases. And it also will give you an opportunity to kind of solidify that new configuration model as you walk through this migrating the config. So there are other options, but this is a great time to start fresh.
Yeah, I agree. Like when you're moving to a whole new system, upgrading and migrating, it's good to clean it up. Make sure you start fresh. Make sure you don't bring in some settings that will trash your current configuration. You want to be able to optimize it to the best of your ability. But yeah, I know there's definitely configurations where even some where you made a change and maybe you start thinking like, I don't even know how that worked, but I'm not going to touch it. And then
yeah, you're not too sure if it's going to impact someone.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just things like that where now's a good time to start maybe planning this migration and then bring everything in new. Like you don't need to bring in all the stuff you don't need in order to just clog up your new installation again. What are some of the, like, did you come across any horror stories when you were migrating? Any customers there where they trying to bring on something and you're arguing over we should just leave that out, leave that behind in the Air OS days?
I don't know if I've seen horror stories, but I've definitely, so a lot of these deployments, we've migrated portions of the config over with the migration tool. And because you're spending more time in the 9800 finding where the config is and making sure the migration happened properly, you start to see things and you ask the customer, what is this? Like, why was it configured this way? And they don't know. It was something that they forgot about from 5 years ago, or it was something they were testing. And that's the kind of stuff that if you take this opportunity to just sort of interview the customer and determine what you want to accomplish and kind of start fresh with a config, it's a good time to implement new best practices, enabling 11K and 11V, maybe 11R if they can support it, to make the WLAN operate better versus just migrating over the old settings.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So definitely planning is going to be involved, conversations, and then reviewing the configuration prior to just deploying it on the new controller, which is a good segue to your next tip, which is the configuration tool or migrator translator. I don't know what the official name is.
The official name, at least as it's stated in the 9800, is the Air OS configuration translator. Okay. So it's built into the 9800's web UI. When you're logged into the 9800, there's a menu option for the Air OS configuration translator, and you click on that, and it asks you for a configuration file from your Air OS controller. You save your config off the Air OS and then upload it here in the browser as an attached file, and it will digest it, and it sits there and churns for a minute or so, and then it gives you a nice pie chart that shows up that says how much of the configuration it was able to understand, how much of it was unable to understand, and how much of it doesn't apply to the 9800, things that don't exist anymore, concepts that don't carry over. And it shows you very well on the screen, like how close it's able to get migrating the config. And I don't think this tool is ever going to be to a point where you can just give it an Air OS file and it will output something that
perfect.
You can just upload controller and boot it. Right. Like there's always going to be something you're going to have to tweak. And I encourage people to use it kind of piecemeal. So you can download the translated configuration, and it does a great job of commenting everything out. It'll show exactly what lines of Air OS code it used to determine this new bit of 9800 config. So it's all commented in the config with pound signs. And you can go through it and say, okay, well, this 9800 thing is new to me and I don't understand enough about the config. I'm just going to port this part over. I'm going to migrate this from my Air OS because I don't know how to set it up. You can do that. You can have just sections of it that you can paste over because the configuration makes so much more sense than it used to in Air OS where it was all spread around. You have that option to take certain pieces, migrate them, and other pieces you could start fresh. So at least run your config through the translator, get the output, and if nothing else, you can just learn from it what the config would look like, what the structure looks like.
So that's a really neat tool that Cisco created and built into the 9800. But you're also saying you could download it and try it out yourself to see what that looks like, and then be able to just So does it comment everything, and then you can just uncomment the ones you do want to port over?
No, the way that it works, so the 9800 config is not commented, but it throws in the AirOS config lines as comments above it, which is awesome. So it shows exactly where this came from. Like, why did it do this? Well, you look just above it, and you'll see that the lines of AirOS config that it determined should be this in 9800.
Yeah, I don't know why that didn't click for me when you said that first. It actually translated.
I probably didn't say it, but yeah, it literally throws the AirOS config in the 9800 config. It's just commented out so you can see what it is.
That's neat. Okay, that's really cool.
Once you throw it on the controller, that all goes away. But in the file, you can see the comments and see what it did.
Yeah. So it gives you an opportunity to learn and understand what exactly you're actually going to transfer over. And I think even just going through that file alone is going to be useful for a lot of people.
Yep, I agree. And the tool is available, like I said, it's in the 9800. It's also available on the web, on Cisco's website, and it's in Prime. If you have any of those accessible to you, you can run through it and just see what it looks like. But it gives you kind of a score. It'll say 88% of it I understood, which is kind of neat.
So what happens to the portions that it says, I can't port this over, but it's a feature that you need? You just got to do that manually, right?
Yeah, so some of the stuff that it doesn't understand, like real complex radius configs or things like that, it might not understand. Some of it just doesn't apply anymore. Some AP group stuff that doesn't apply anymore. I can't think of other examples, but I've seen things that just don't make sense. For instance, the virtual interface. There is no concept of virtual interface in the 9800. So everybody set that up on the AirOS controllers. That line is going to fall into the this doesn't apply anymore category because there isn't a virtual interface on the 9800.
Gotcha. And when you're uploading your code, your AirOS code to the or AirOS configuration into the 9800, and then it shows it to you there, is that an option? There's an option for somebody to just say, okay, apply this new config to the controller?
Yes. Yeah. And don't do that because it applies all of it. And like I said, I don't think it's ever the tool. I don't think is going to be perfect enough that you can just click go and it'll put it at the startup config and boot it. Maybe someone is having better luck with it than me, but it gets it 80 to 90% of the way there for me. And that's great because I can take those sections of the config that are easier to migrate and use them. And then the rest of it just do myself. And most of the time I'm using this tool, the 9800 is already online. I've already configured it, staged it initially, and I'm doing the initial portions of the config. I don't really want to start over. I've already done the work of getting it on the network.
Yeah.
I just want to add to the config.
Gotcha. Okay. So your recommendation is use a config translator and then copy and paste the sections into the 9800.
Yep.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So we've nailed down, talked about the tips on migrating, understanding the configuration model, starting fresh, and this config translator. What is your next tip on migrating, Dave?
So the next thing is that it's important to remember that you can establish a mobility relationship between the 9800 and your older AirOS controllers that you're migrating from. So you can actually put them in a mobility group, and that allows roaming between the new and the old, as well as smoother migration. APs, you can just configure them to go to the other controller and they'll move over there instead of having to clear their config and do a discovery process. That makes the migration a lot smoother. So you can even establish mobility back with the 5508 if you get the special release of code from TAC. There's a documented version of code that you can get from TAC that'll go all the way back to a 5508. So if you're migrating from one of those, you can still establish mobility with the 9800, and I think that's pretty cool. I didn't expect that level of kind of reverse engineering or whatever, being able to talk to things that old. It's nice to have that option. So it really gives you a lot more capability for migrating smoothly.
Yeah, for sure. Because there's a lot of people who have stuck with the 5508s, and I know in my environment there were still portions not too long ago with 5508s because that's just what has been there even since before I joined. And I think having this ability to make it easy for customers to migrate to the newer version is always going to be a huge benefit for the vendor. So Cisco's doing a good job at least making some ways to port from legacy equipment to new. And I know it's not always easy because they're different. It's different infrastructure, right? It's just vastly different. So trying to be able to create that bridge is often not easy to do. And with a lot of technologies, you just kind of have to peel the Band-Aid and migrating to something new.
And the other thing that having that mobility relationship established allows you to do is use your old controllers as mobility anchors. So if you're not ready to get rid of the old hardware, you can actually use them as a guest anchor. Put it in the DMZ, establish that relationship with the 9800, and then you can tunnel your guest traffic out to the DMZ through your old controller. So those can live on in a different purpose. Instead of having APs on them, now they can be a guest anchor.
You could, I guess you could also use them if you have APs that are not supported by the new platform. Old APs laying around. Yeah.
Yep. So if the 9800s allow you to go back to Wave 1 access points. So the 700 series, 1700, 27, 3700. That's the oldest access point that you can put on a 9800, it's pretty old, to be honest. I was surprised they went back 2 generations of access points. But if you've got some 2600s or something that's 11N, you could keep that on your old controller and then have that mobility relationship set up so that you can roam between the new and the old. You obviously don't want new APs and old APs in the same building, but you could have them be in separate buildings and still part of your infrastructure until you've got the means to replace the old gear. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and that's actually your last tip is you're still able to use your Wave 1 APs, and you've established that anything older than that, it's not going to be able to migrate to the 9800, which means there's a good reason to keep some of your old controllers, but still move forward in migrating to a newer platform. So you can still work with both old and new, gives you a way to phase your upgrade and then deal with areas where they just have old APs. You just won't be able to either upgrade them in this time frame, but you also don't want them to hold you back from upgrading the rest of the infrastructure, right? So there's a way to not just leave those guys behind and then not give them any wireless just because it's not supported in the 9800. So you keep your older controller for that purpose.
Exactly.
Wow.
So yeah, Dave, I have a question for you. So let's say we talked about older APs, but let's say you want to test the new Wi-Fi 6 APs, right? And in order to do so, you have to upgrade your controller, your AirOS controller. So in this scenario, wouldn't it be easier to just spin off a 9800 controller on the side and then use that to test your Wi-Fi 6 APs?
So I was having a little trouble hearing you, but you're saying for migrating to the new APs, is it easier to spin up a 9800?
Yes.
Yeah. Testing it.
Yeah, you could absolutely spin up a virtual 9800 and move some APs over to it for testing, test the new configuration, and then move forward with it. Yeah, I strongly encourage folks to do that to make sure that you got it right. After you migrated the config, make sure it's doing what you want it to do, and
test it to your clients that are not Wi-Fi 6 capable, and make sure those clients can operate with their applications on a Wi-Fi 6 AP because it's new hardware, new chipset. So you want to be able to test the backwards compatibility, I guess is the way to put it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we always go back to this virtual 9800 because it makes sense to at least spin that up in a virtual environment. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't have a virtual or ESXi or something, the even ability to add it to the AWS cloud, there is nothing holding you back from at least testing it out and being able to test your AirOS configuration to your iOS XE version. And so you don't run into an issue where you have these 9800s and then you're kind of in the dark going, whoa, what happened here? Go ahead, Francois.
No, sorry. Never mind.
Okay. But the tools that are available to help us migrate and have the virtual version, like those are tools that you could use to test it out and be able to have a smoother migration, right?
Yeah, before you commit to the hardware. And I think Francois even wrote a blog article on how to get it running on a MacBook. So you don't even need an ESXi environment. You can spin it up and do it in a very small scale on your laptop.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you have an AP, you just need one AP, either your Wave 2 AP or test out a new Wi-Fi 6 AP and just play around with it. I mean, that's what we do, right? We tweak, we tinker, we try to understand how this works. This is a completely new position that Cisco's going into, and eventually these AirOS controllers are going to go away. I mean, they're already building the iOS XE versions. That's, I think, where they're going to put most of the effort. And so eventually we'll see less effort into the AirOS controllers unless, there's a couple of big companies that say don't sunset them. And maybe hopefully they don't last as long as the Catalyst 6500. Dave, do you have any other, maybe some gotchas that people should be aware of when they're migrating?
Other than just that, not use the tool to create the entire config. That's a pretty big gotcha. Make sure that the version of your old controller and the version of the new controller are compatible, because the 9800s, like you said, there aren't very many versions, but the enhancements or the differences between the versions are pretty substantial. So make sure that you're on a version that's compatible with your old controller and your old APs, et cetera, and your new APs. So you look at that configuration matrix or version matrix and make sure that everything jives there. I don't know if there's any other gotchas. Just get that config model into your head somehow. And troubleshooting wise, so one thing I will say, it's not a gotcha, but it's a tip. When you're trying to wrap your head around that config model, I would recommend walking backwards. So start with the access point. So if you go to configuration access points in the UI, it will list your APs and it will show which tags are bound to the AP and why. So it will show which policy tag, which site tag, and which RF tag is bound to the access point. And it will say how it got the tags, whether they were statically assigned or automatically assigned by a filter. And then you can walk backwards and say, okay, it has these tags, so I'm going to go look at those tags and see what configuration is bound to the tags. And then you can figure out why it's behaving the way it is. So if it's doing something unexpected, that's where I would start.
That's a good tip, because of the inheritance and those tags. It's important, and that drives back to understanding the configuration model.
Yep.
Yeah. I think if you also try to play with the netconf and, programming your configuration, I think it can also help you to study this configuration model and better understand it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it as well. As we transform our skill sets and understand programmability a bit more, I feel like having to program things using Python makes you understand the architecture a little bit more, right? Because you want to get something specific, then you actually have to understand, say, this configuration model in order to grab what you need. So I think that's important, especially when you're going through Dave's lab on setting up your Grafana and the telemetry. It'll help you understand what the configuration model is, and then what information you need to grab in order to graph it or log it, for example. But yeah, I mean, these were good tips, Dave. So like the first tip again was the understanding the configuration model. Number 2 is starting fresh. So this is number 2 means is you're able to get rid of like legacy configurations or configurations you no longer use. Tip number 3 was utilize the AirOS config translator to understand how your AirOS config is going to look like in iOS XE. But then Dave does not recommend just applying the whole thing, take it in pieces and then paste it into your controller. Tip number 4 is establishing mobility with your existing controllers. So you can establish mobility between the 9800 and the older controllers and then migrate your APs over. And then you could still utilize your older controllers for other purposes, like Dave mentioned. And then tip number 5 was you can go as far back as Wave 1 APs onto the Catalyst 9800. So maybe with the older controllers, you still keep the legacy APs on there until it's time to upgrade those APs and migrate them over to the 9800. Anything else you want to add, Francois?
No, just mention Dave's blog. His blog, it's reference Wi-Fi reference.com. Sorry, Dave. He has a couple of articles on the 9800. He has one where you can actually build your 9800 in your lab on an Intel NUC platform. He has the one we mentioned about the the telemetry and how you can create your Grafana dashboard. He also has one on the 9130 access points. And these blogs are amazing. They have tons of screenshots. I don't know how long it took you to put them together, Dave, but man, they're really good. You can pretty much follow screenshot per screenshot and get it working on your site. So I just wanted to mention that.
Awesome. Dave, thanks for joining us here on the show. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and your experience on migrating from AirOS to the 9800 with these tips that you've given us. Where can people find you online?
So I am Bald Wi-Fi Guy on Twitter. And as Francois mentioned, my blog is wifireference.com.
Awesome. And I highly encourage everyone to follow Dave on Twitter because he does post Catalyst 9800 tips on there as well. You've done quite a few of them and they're pretty engaging. There's a lot of people who have commented on them, and it gives us insight into what it will look like when we move to this newer architecture of the controllers from Cisco.
Yeah, I'm trying very hard to do it weekly. It doesn't always happen, but I'm trying to make it so that when you start your journey on a 9800, you can search that hashtag and see a bunch of the tips right off the bat.
Awesome. Well, again, head over to the show notes. If you guys have any questions, that's going to be cleartosend.net/205, where we have all the links out to Dave's blog and some of the release notes for the 9800, Dave's different blog articles on setting up telemetry, and also some of the lab items for the 9800 as well. It's a good resource to start if you're looking into getting into the 9800. So if you want to review all those tips, we'll list them all out. And then if you guys have any other questions, you can either comment on the show notes page or hit us up on Twitter. But Dave, thanks for joining us on the show. Francois, thank you for joining as well. We will see everyone on the next episode. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. Have a good week.